Hi everyone, I'm James Fitz here with 30-Minute Book Reports, here to review Liar's Poker. It's the view I'm looking at, it's on the right, my hand's on the wrong. We'll get used to this. This is review number 1 for what I hope will be a long project. I'm trying to do a live stream of reading every day, and if I keep at the pace we're going, we'll get to a good amount of these book reports. So, yesterday and the day before, you might have read along with my Liar's Poker. I also have it written on this board here. It's my list of books to read. So, I'll make a recommendation and book will get on the list, and hopefully I'll get to it. Anyway, Liar's Poker, it's a book by Michael Lewis, who is famous for writing books that become movies, and also famous for turning the financial world into a understandable, easy for the common man to understand without a finance background, what's going on and what the implications of the financial world might have on the rest of the world. But this story is actually a little bit more about the culture of Wall Street. And it's told kind of, so Michael was a salesman, a bond salesman for Solomon Brothers. Okay, now I can tell already my weakness in doing these book reports is going to be that I'm very, very bad with names. So if you are upset with that, or you need people to say the right names or pronounce them right, please just let me know in the chat, and then I'll correct it. But otherwise, I have no way. I mean, I can write down the names, but the problem is when I read, I don't really hear the name when I see it. I just see it as a symbol that stands for the character. It's something I have to improve on in my reading. I'm going to work on it when I do this. So, anyway. Michael Lewis, he worked for Solomon Brothers and during the mid-'80s. And so this is a story about Solomon Brothers and kind of the culture of bond trading and the kind of upper echelon of finance jobs, and what the culture was like at the time and how it was created, and a little bit of the backstory, and then a little bit of the implications that go along with it. So, if that's enough to intrigue you, then you're already here. You're like me, so this book appealed to me because I really like reading history that delves into one small segment, and then you build up enough of those segments and you can see how everything connects. So this is like U.S. and a little bit of global finance in the early 80s, or in the 80s, I'll say. I don't think it really goes that much into the 90s, a little bit in the 70s as well. So, the other reason you want to read this is Michael Lewis is a pretty famous author. He also wrote the books that inspired the movies Moneyball and The Big Short, which were great movies, you know. Yeah, Moneyball, the baseball one with Brad Pitt about the numbers and the Orioles, and The Big Short about the mortgage financial crisis. So Michael Lewis he's the main character of this book, and so we see the story kind of through his eyes as he went through his journey through Solomon Brothers. He meets all of these characters, and it's one of my favorite formats for a book is the main character being an idiot of sorts, and then the reader learning vicariously through that narrator, and hopefully they have some reflection by the end that they've learned, and then they can go back and spice up the tale with what I know now. If I knew then what I know now, I would write a book, and then I would tell myself those things. So, Michael Lewis, he went to Princeton, he got an art degree, and then he went to the London School of Economics and got some kind of PhD in economics. So he likes to think of himself, I suppose, as a little bit like he recognizes he's not an everyman, but he's not, he doesn't see himself as a pure alpha, I suppose. And this is a story about the alphas in our society, the ones who they think, what do I want out of the world, and it's money, and then I'll do anything to get it. Or I'll work as hard as I can, or I'll be as abrasive as I need to be, or what have you. So, in the early 80s, Salomon Brothers was kind of the pinnacle of this type of environment, where it's like the movie image, because it's based on this, really. It's like they're on the trading floor, they're saying they're on 3 different phone calls at the same time. And the way that this book starts is one of the best first chapters of a book I've ever read, where it begins with introducing Gottfried, who is the chairman of Salomon Brothers at the time, gives a little bit of a backstory into him, and how he sold the company for $40 million, and how he rose through the ranks and inherited it from the actual Solomon, son of Solomon, who was the owner at the time. And then it describes the floor, the setting, it plays the setting, and then it describes his best man. And there's a little bit of a contest. What the book is named after, Liar's Poker. So this is a game that was played in Wall Street at the time, kind of like, it kind of reminded me of like Ender's Game, how they have the mock games, and it's like it's a microcosm of the types of skills and abilities you need in the real environment that they need. So Liar's Poker, it's all about bluffing, it's about reading your opponent, it's about knowing the numbers and the odds and the statistics of an event occurring, and then waging that against the opponent's likelihood of bluffing. And so what they do actually is they take a dollar bill, and then they go around and they say how many of each number they have. So it's like, I got on the serial number of the dollar, and they say, oh, I have 3 5s, and the next person's like, well, I got 4 5s, and I got 5 6s. It progresses like whatever. So it's a silly game, but in the world, what it really reminded me of is Michael Jordan rolling the quarters, throwing quarters close to the wall at the end or during the finals in that Jordan documentary. It's like, what do the people who can't turn it off? You know someone who they're one way. They're like Arlie or me, So these people in their break time, they play this game and they gamble. And so Gottfried, the CEO, not the CEO, the chairman or whatever, the guy, he's at the very top. And then there's a guy who he's the best, right? And so he makes all the money. And everybody really respects him because he's the guy who makes the money, and that's where the respect comes from in this society. And so he's also the best at Liar's Poker. So, for whatever reason, Gottfried goes up to, his name starts with an M, cannot remember, and says, challenge you to a game of Liar's Poker. No crying, $1 million. And so word scatters throughout the office. It really plays up to the level of gossip that is in this world, because everyone's on 2 phones at the same time. Everyone's calling each other. Everyone knows the same basis of information. Everyone knows what everyone else knows. So it creates kind of this very interesting environment, or very close-knit environment. But that makes an exclusive environment as well, because it's hard to get in, it's hard to know all the gossip, it's hard to know everything that's going on. And so that's why that knowledge is what makes you the money. We'll get to that more later. So anyway, guy's name, the Liar's Poker champion. He knows that there's a chance that he could lose. This isn't a purely statistical game. This is a game that has a little bit of luck, a little bit of confidence, and so $1 million he goes through, and what he replied, he knows that Gottfried is worth $45 million, right? He's probably only worth 10, 15, or something like that. So he says to Gottfried back, I'm not going to play for just $1 million. If I'm going to play, I'm going to play for 10. Right? He's going all in. Right? And he knows that it's going to be a lot harder for Godfrey to call, and also putting him on his heels, being the guy who he has this rule, he never says no. In one challenge, he always has to say yes. But he knows Godfrey doesn't have that rule, and so it's this like game within the game. He played the game before the game even happened. He bluffed him, right? No, who knows? He might have played the game, he might have won, and then he go get a job at freaking Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs. Okay, so the reason that first chapter is so great is because it does a lot of things in kind of an exciting, adventurous way. One, it establishes some of the important characters. It gives you the setting of the 41st floor of Solomon Brothers, where all the trading is going on. It gives you a setting of the gossip and what all this is. But it also gives you what the conflict for these people is, and its competitiveness, and its winning and making money. And that's what it's all about. So, the second chapter introduces Michael Lewis, right? And so it introduces him and kind of explains the story of how he got his job at Solomon Brothers. And it's kind of a funny little story about he was getting his PhD at the London School of Economics, which he kind of like brushes under the rug, or like kind of he makes him seem like a little bit more of a fish out of water than he probably was. But everybody was at the time. There's no one who was like, oh, this is my place. Except for this one guy who was a great character in the second or third chapter who maybe he knew someone higher up. They didn't quite know how he was so connected, but he was secure in his job, and he like put his feet up and was like ordering people around when he was way younger than everyone else. Can't remember that guy's name either. Maybe I should write down the names, and maybe I have a chance of remembering better. Anyway, so Michael Lewis, he got this job. So he was at this event with the Queen, and it turned out to be an event where it's like 1,000 salesmen who all like paid to have the Queen wave at him. So anyway, he's there, and he happens to be sitting between two Solomon brother partners' wives, or managers, or something like that. And when he told one of them what he was looking to do, he wanted to get into like corporate finance. She kind of like looked down her nose, like, you want to get into corporate finance? That's where like people trade. So a lot of this book is like laying out the social strata of the different financial jobs you can have. So at the top is like selling mortgage bonds. It's Solomon in 86, right? And so the next two chapters really lay out in a very cool way the different levels of these things. So the first one we're introduced to is corporate finance is not nearly as cool as bonds, or as like being on the trading floor. Because there you're just like doing paperwork. You're not actually like making money. You're not doing action, right? Still, everything still pays well. It's out of context. So anyway, she kind of convinces him and like grills him. She does a whole interview, and then she says she'll tell her husband that he can have the job. And then afterwards, the Queen comes by with her corgis, and the Solomon brothers' wife is like, "Hey, Queen, nice dogs you got there." You know, and it's like an example of her being like uncouth, and it's showing our Solomon brothers in the context of Wall Street are like the uncouth, the uncultivated. They're not the ones with the degrees, or at least that's what they were in the early '80s. Now to get in, it's a lot more difficult. Hence why he went to the London School of Economics. So the third chapter goes through, he's like, I graduated from Princeton with an art history degree, and I tried to get a finance job, and I realized it was really tough. And like 6,000 people are applying for this job that, 50 people get, or whatever it is. So I realized that's why I had to go to the London School of Economics. And so anyway, so he gets through this job, and he gets into the, like, they don't give an interesting detail. They didn't give him the job, Like, they kind of danced around, they didn't want it, because then that puts them in the wrong side of the bargaining table. So he had to phone and tell them he accepted the job without it being offered. It was kind of a weird, like, game they play. But he goes through a lot of the hoops that he heard other people had to jump through that he didn't, so he feels like he was kind of given a golden ticket through this back door entry where other people had to go through these grueling interview processes where they would, like, tell you to open a window and the window was sealed shut just to see how you give up or how you keep working or whatever the test was. Sometimes people would come in and then give them the silent treatment for 20 minutes and then see how they panic or whatever, just to be, just alpha moves to say I'm the boss and you do what I tell you to do or whatever, put you in a position of bargaining. But then at the end, they give him a salary of like, it was like $48,000 a year, which at the time, I guess was a lot. And so he goes back to his professor at the London School of Economics, and the professor's like, that's twice as much as I make, and I'm a tenured professor. So it shows how, like, why this job was in such demand. But he does lay out kind of an interesting moment where he talks about, a guy says that if it didn't match supply and demand, like if the demand is so high, then and the supply is so high, then why aren't you just paid less? Like, why do you need to get paid so much more? But I guess it's probably from once you start making money, which you do really, really fast, then the bargaining chips. I don't know exactly. It's weird. They never answered that. Partially the way he answered it was the way that he bombed the first interview when he was coming through from Princeton rather than through the London School and the backdoor Queen route. He was asked the question, why do you want to work for Salomon Brothers? And he said, I want to make a lot of money. And then they kicked him out. And apparently, people don't talk about money like that. Even though everybody knows it's the real motivation, you can't be explicit about it. It's kind of unspoken. That's kind of interesting, where it's like, because the numbers are so egregious that it's like, and everybody knows it already. If you're already on the floor, you don't talk about it. And I don't know. He alluded to it as like a cultural thing. That was like, you didn't know it. Like, so much of the test was like knowing what to say and knowing who to impress, and it's so much more of a social game than it is necessarily a numbers game. But you also have to know the numbers. So my second favorite chapter was the third chapter, where they're in like a training room. So there's like 130 people in the class, his training class, and it's for like 6 months. And the way he describes the classroom is very like, it's the front of the class is the classic front of the class, and the back of the class is the classic back of the class, but like times 10. Where it's like, if a teacher comes in who they like shouldn't respect, everyone's like throwing papers at him. Even Michael admits to throwing papers at a guy who was like supposed to not, who was like. So the way that the training worked was like, different speakers would come in from different departments and kind of say what they do and explain what's going on or how they do stuff. And then at the end, you would be placed into the different departments. And so it was really like sorting hat times like 1,000. And so like this was great because each of the people who came in, you were able to see how they represented the different departments and how the strata of the financial departments was laid out. And it's basically like whoever makes the most money and has the most power, that's the job you want. And so the alphas go get that job, and then the more, and then you want to work in New York. So it was great because it laid out like, okay, you want to sell bonds, you don't want to be a salesman. Okay, you want to work in mortgage because that's where Salomon Brothers has more of a monopoly. You don't necessarily want to work in junk bonds, even though 10 years later, junk bonds became the new vogue. So, as far as like learning about finance, that was probably the most informative chapter, that third chapter. But really what you learn is that throughout the book is that the government influences what the cool segment is, because they can give a tax break to mortgages or reconfigure a law around junk bonds, and all of a sudden there's $1 billion to be made. And if you have the right company structure built up to already, you got the salesmen who already know the numbers on that sector of the market, then everyone will come to you, and because you're the name. And so this is what happened with Salomon Brothers with mortgage bonds. And so the next couple of chapters kind of lay out the development of this niche of, okay, Salomon Brothers realized there was this big opportunity in mortgage bonds, and so they built up this big department, and they were actually wrong, but then the government changed the law, and it made them right all of a sudden, and they had this big department. And so they talk about, like, the guy who figured it out, and then a guy usurped him, and he made this giant department that was unnecessarily large, and it was losing money, but then all of a sudden it became the biggest department in the world, where it was like it made half of their money, and they were the biggest department on Wall Street, and potentially maybe the biggest bond in the world, maybe the biggest market in the world. He's very precise with how big it is, but it made like $1 billion in a year or something like that. So that was very interesting to see, just seeing the succession and how that like builds up. And that was a cool segment of the chapter, and it kind of explains why the different firms in context of each other. So you got like Goldman Sachs, and you got like First Boston, and their different places in the Wall Street society. And then you also get why and a little bit of backstory from each one. So that was super informative. There's a lot of stuff I didn't really know about, and now I feel like there's a whole, like I know I have better context for each of these pieces in the world of finance. So then after we see that, we go back to Michael Lewis and his story, and so he actually gets sent to London, or he works on the 41st floor as like a trained, like, observes what's going on, and then his first like position, he goes to London to work as a bond salesman. I forget if it was government, corporate, or mortgage. Anyway, and so he learns the way of being a salesman, and he has these proteges, and they teach him what to do, and he really professes like, I know so little, but then he has like this tricky plays, and he rises through the ranks and becomes they call it big swinging dicks. He goes from being a geek all the way up, and he shows how he's able to sell stuff, and it's, there's a little bit of adventure to it. And this part, there's not as much like, it's more progressing through the story, and it's showing the story of the boom, which he really lays out the whole time is like Salomon Brothers expanded too quickly, and then because they had all of the knowledge for mortgage bonds, all of their employees would just leave to get paid more at other companies, and they would get paid like $1 million a year instead of like $100,000 or whatever. And then $10 million, and then $40 million, and then everything goes up and up. And then it goes into this part about how then mortgage bonds no longer were really the thing, even though all the Salomon Brothers mortgage people were in every other company. Then junk bonds became the thing, and I think it was Drexel was the captain of that. And so the thing about junk bonds is it allowed corporate takeovers to occur much more easily than they had before. Very interesting. He explained how that happens. He could kind of lay it out where it's like junk bonds are bonds for companies that are like new or old and not performing well. So like there's a good chance they'll go bankrupt. And he realized they were undervalued just because people don't like risk. The risk was being like valued incorrectly. So he made it more popular by like boosting all the sales, and then it became more popular, like too popular. And so then there weren't enough companies that were junk bonds. So then if you do a corporate takeover, it like creates junk bonds somehow. And that's really what the market is. And so he sells the junk bonds that are created through the hostile takeover, and it allows for smaller companies to do hostile takeovers than were before. So this is huge. It like changes the corporate landscape in the late 80s. And it also changes who's the big swinging dick in Wall Street. And so Solomon Brothers, he also talks about how they, like, because they overexpanded in their, like, bond and mortgage department, and in London, and they were just expanding, even though all their people were leaving, their idea was, oh, we'll just replace a guy who makes $1 million with 10 trainees who make $100,000, but it was like eating away underneath. And then they got rid of their mortgage or their junk bond department or whatever it was that would make them money in junk bonds or whatever. And so then Drexel ended up doing a hostile takeover of them, and Michael Lewis was on his way out anyway, because he had a bit of like a breakdown, not a breakdown, but like he starts off one chapter describing a fever dream he had where the hotel service wasn't as not like he was like yelling at the bellhop about there's no fruit bowl and his bathrobe is unkempt or whatever. And that's the way it is when you stay at the fanciest hotels and you make absorbent amounts of money as you start to be entitled. If you're making, and the amount of money you're making for yourself isn't even anything compared to the amount of money you're making for the firm, so you feel undervalued even though you're really overvalued. Is it the firm making the money or is it you? That's the real question. So I think that was a pretty good summary of the book. I tried to keep it at that 30-minute mark. This is my first time doing 30 minutes, so this was pretty good. So I did this book. We're pretty free form. Going in the future, I might organize it a little bit more. Might talk about more main characters. It's probably going to vary by the type of book that I do. This one was kind of more easy to just go through and give a big summary of the book. But probably in the future, I'd like to do a little bit more analysis of the parts I found interesting. Give a little bit more highlights. This one just had a lot of highlights. It was very well organized, and it really informed a lot for the amount of action that I was able to have. So anyway, thanks for listening to 30-Minute Book Reports.